The year is 1213 BCE, and in the royal palace of Ramesses, beneath painted columns that rise like palm groves toward gilded ceilings, the great pharaoh Ramses II closes his eyes, not in death, as history would have recorded, but in a sleep from which he will awaken, again, and again, and again. The physicians withdraw, their oils and incantations failing to explain what they witness. The old king's chest continues to rise and fall. His weathered hands, which have signed treaties and wielded ceremonial weapons for 6 to 7 years of rule, do not stiffen into the stillness of the afterlife. Outside, the Nile flows as it always has, indifferent to the impossible, and Ramses, son of Ra, lord of the two lands, begins a journey not into the field of reeds, but forward through time itself. The body that should have been mummified, preserved for eternity in linen and natron, instead preserves itself, through means no ancient magic could have foreseen. And so we begin, not with an ending, but with an endlessness, tracing the path of a man who built monuments to immortality, only to discover that immortality itself is the longest monument of all. In those first decades after his supposed death, Ramses watches as his son Merneptah assumes the double crown, and the old pharaoh, concealed now in the guise of a royal advisor, a distant cousin, begins to understand the weight of what has happened. He cannot reveal himself, for what king can return from death without throwing the cosmic order of Marat into chaos? And so he learns the first lesson of immortality, that you must become your own ghost, haunting the edges of the world you once commanded. He moves through the courts of his successors like a shadow, offering wisdom that seems uncanny, speaking of details from Hittite negotiations that no scribe could remember, and gradually, carefully, he learns to forget himself, to let Ramses the Great become a memory, a legend, while he becomes something smaller, something that can move through time unnoticed. Centuries pass, and the Egypt of Ramses transforms around him like a river changing course. The new kingdom fades into twilight, the great age of pyramid builders and god-kings slowly eroding under the weight of time and foreign influence. He sees the great temples he built at Abu Simbel, those 4 colossal statues of his younger self seated in eternal judgment, and he feels a strange disconnection, as though looking at monuments to a stranger. The Ramses who carved those stones believed in endings, in a glorious death followed by resurrection in the company of the gods. But this Ramses, still breathing, still aging in imperceptible slowness, discovers that there are fates the ancients never prepared for, never imagined. By the time Alexander the Great marches his Macedonian armies into the Nile Delta in 332 BCE, Ramses has lived through more than 800 years, and he watches from a dusty corner of Memphis as the young conqueror, barely 25 years old, declares himself pharaoh, adopting the ancient titles, seeking legitimacy through traditions that Ramses himself once embodied. There is something bittersweet in it, seeing how the symbols of power he helped shape are now worn by Greeks, by outsiders who speak no Egyptian, who worship different gods but understand that Egypt's mystique is a crown in itself. Ramses, now appearing as an elderly scholar, a keeper of temple records, sees Alexander visit the oracle at Siwa, seeking confirmation of his divine parentage, and the immortal pharaoh almost smiles, recognizing the hunger for immortality in the young man's eyes. But Alexander will die at 32 in Babylon, while Ramses will continue, and he begins to understand that immortality means watching everyone else's desperate grasping for eternity, while you alone possess it, unwanted, unending. Under the Ptolemies, Egypt becomes something new, a fusion of Greek and Egyptian, a place where pharaohs speak Greek, and the Library of Alexandria rises as a beacon of knowledge that would have astounded the priests of Ramses' youth. He finds himself drawn to this library, this vast collection of scrolls and papyri, and for the first time in centuries, he allows himself to learn rather than merely survive. He reads philosophy, Greek, Persian, Indian texts translated and debated by scholars who have no idea that among them sits a man who once ruled this land when their civilizations were younger, less certain. He reads about time, about Heraclitus claiming you cannot step in the same river twice, and he thinks, yes, but what if you are the river? What if you flow forward while everything around you steps in, steps out, is born and dies and is forgotten? During these centuries, he witnesses Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemaic pharaohs, brilliant and doomed, and he sees in her a reflection of his own reign, the grand ambitions, the certainty of power, the belief that will and intelligence can shape history. He is in Alexandria when she dies, when Egypt becomes a province of Rome, and he feels the weight of it, the final transformation of the land he once ruled into something unrecognizable, no longer the center of the world, but an exotic periphery to a greater empire. The Roman centuries are long, stretching across the assassination of Caesar, the rise of Augustus, the madness of Caligula, the bureaucratic efficiency of Hadrian. Ramses moves through them like a traveler on an endless road, sometimes in Egypt, watching the old temples fall into disrepair, seeing Christianity spread through the same cities where he once offered sacrifices to Amun-Ra. Sometimes in Rome itself, walking streets of marble and corruption, seeing emperors claim divinity with none of the cosmic responsibility that once accompanied such claims. He is in Rome when Constantine converts the empire to Christianity, and he understands that the gods he served, the gods who were supposed to guarantee eternal life, are being forgotten, replaced by a new story of resurrection, of a single God who died and returned. There is irony here, that he, who never died, watches the worship of a God whose central promise is victory over death. By the time Rome falls, by the time the barbarians sweep through and the empire fragments into warring kingdoms, Ramses has lived for more than 2,500 years, and he has learned to move like water, adapting to whatever vessel contains him, merchant, scholar, soldier, slave, always anonymous, always watching, carrying within him memories of a world so ancient that even the Romans considered it ancient. The medieval period finds him wandering through Byzantium with its golden mosaics and theological debates, through the early Islamic caliphates where Arabic becomes the language of science and philosophy, through Europe's dark ages where knowledge retreats into monasteries and castles. He is in Baghdad during its golden age, when the House of Wisdom gathers scholars from across the known world, and he contributes what he can, anonymously, sharing fragments of astronomical knowledge that Egyptian priests calculated millennia before, watching as Arabic numerals revolutionize mathematics. He travels the Silk Road, seeing the world expand beyond the Mediterranean that defined his mortal reign, discovering China, India, Persia, civilizations that flourished while he was building Abu Simbel, civilizations that never knew his name. The Mongol invasions sweep across Asia like a storm, and Ramses, who once commanded armies, who once signed the first peace treaty with the Hittites, watches empires rise and fall with increasing detachment. He begins to notice something, that human patterns repeat: ambition, war, peace, decline, cycling like seasons, and his own long life allows him to see these cycles clearly, the way a man on a mountaintop can see weather patterns that those in the valley experience as chaos. The Renaissance arrives, and with it, a rediscovery of the ancient world, but an ancient world mediated through Greek and Roman sources. Egypt remains mysterious, its hieroglyphs unreadable, its history wrapped in legend. Ramses is in Italy when artists begin painting scenes of Exodus and pharaohs, getting everything wrong, portraying Egyptian kings in Renaissance armor, giving them European faces, and he feels the peculiar loneliness of being erased by imagination. He watches as explorers set out for new worlds, as Columbus sails west, as Magellan's expedition circumnavigates the globe, and he understands that the world is both larger and smaller than the ancients believed, larger in physical space, smaller in its fundamental sameness, people everywhere seeking power, meaning, legacy. He is in Florence when Leonardo da Vinci sketches flying machines and studies corpses to understand anatomy, and Ramses, who has lived in the same body for 3,000 years, wonders what the brilliant artist would make of flesh that does not age, does not decay. The printing press spreads, and knowledge begins to democratize, and Ramses realizes that immortality and information share something in common. Both accumulate, both compound, both change the relationship between past and present. By the Enlightenment, by the age of reason and revolution, Ramses has become something like a scholar of humanity itself, observing the French Revolution's promise of liberty and its descent into terror, watching the American experiment in democracy, seeing industrialization transform landscapes and lives at a pace that would have seemed magical to ancient peoples. He is in Paris when Napoleon invades Egypt in 1798. And he watches with complicated feelings as French scholars begin the serious study of his former kingdom, as they discover the Rosetta Stone, as they begin, finally, to unlock the meaning of hieroglyphs. He does not reveal himself to Champollion when the young Frenchman finally cracks the code in 1822. Though he is there, in Paris, watching over the scholar's shoulder as the ancient language yields its secrets, and when Champollion reads the name Ramses, for the first time in 2,000 years, pronouncing it awkwardly but correctly, the immortal pharaoh feels something he has not felt in centuries, a connection to his former self, a bridge across the gulf of time. The 19th century accelerates, railways and telegraphs, photography and evolution, the old certainties crumbling beneath the weight of science and speed, and Ramses, who has seen civilizations rise and fall with glacial slowness, now watches them transform within decades, and he understands that time itself is changing, that humanity is compressing experience, racing forward with an urgency that immortality has long since eroded from his own soul. When archaeologists discover his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, when they find his mummy in 1881, moved from its original resting place by priests trying to protect it from robbers, Ramses is in Cairo, reading about the discovery in a newspaper. He travels to the museum where his preserved body is displayed, and stands before the glass case, looking at the face he once wore, the face that wore the double crown, that commanded armies, that kissed wives and held children. The mummy's face is peaceful, sunken, ancient, but peaceful, and he wonders if this is what he would have looked like had he died as he was meant to. Had he followed the path into the afterlife instead of this endless forward march through time? He reads the scholarly analyses, how they estimate he lived to 90 or 91, how they marvel at his longevity for the ancient world, and he almost laughs, a soft, sad exhalation, because they are examining the shell while the essence stands invisible among them, 4,000 years old and counting. The 20th century arrives with automobiles and airplanes, with world wars that make the battles of his reign seem like skirmishes, with nuclear weapons that can turn cities to dust in moments. And Ramses, who once believed that pharaohs were gods, who once thought that power meant cosmic authority, sees how fragile and fleeting all human power truly is. He is in Egypt when the country gains independence from Britain, when Nasser rises to power, when the Aswan High Dam threatens the temples at Abu Simbel, and UNESCO organizes their relocation, cutting apart the mountain, moving those colossal statues of his younger self piece by piece to higher ground. He watches the process on television, technology allowing him to witness from a distance as the world mobilizes to save monuments built in his name, and he feels grateful, but also strange, because these are not really monuments to him, not to the man he has become, but to an idea of kingship, to a moment in history that ended 4 millennia ago. He walks through modern Cairo, through streets of concrete and traffic, pollution and chaos, and finds himself in the Egyptian Museum, standing once again before his mummy, surrounded by tourists with cameras, guides explaining in a dozen languages who Ramses II was, the warrior, the builder, the father of over 100 children, the pharaoh who may have been the biblical oppressor of Moses. And he listens to these stories about himself and recognizes some truth in them, but also sees how much has been lost, how much misunderstood. And he realizes that this is the ultimate fate of immortality, to become both more and less than you were, to be remembered as a legend while the reality of who you were, the small human details, the doubts and fears and moments of ordinary joy, fade into the abstraction of history. The late 20th century brings him into the digital age, and Ramses, who once communicated through hieroglyphs carved in stone, learns to navigate the internet, sees his own image reproduced endlessly, memes and documentaries, video games where players can build civilizations and conquer as Egypt, and he understands that fame, too, is a form of immortality, but one that distorts, simplifies, reduces complex lives to symbols and slogans. He creates anonymous accounts, participates in forums discussing ancient Egypt, and sometimes, carefully, corrects misconceptions, suggesting alternative interpretations of texts, pointing out details that scholars have missed, and he is largely ignored. His insights dismissed by experts who cannot imagine that someone might actually remember the period they study. In 1976, his mummy is flown to Paris for preservation treatment, issued a passport, because French law requires it, and Ramses reads about this with a kind of wonder, his dead body traveling with documentation, crossing borders, while he himself moves through the world without papers, without official existence, a ghost in the machine of modern bureaucracy. He watches the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of the Internet, September 11th and its aftermath, and through it all, he sees patterns, the same human impulses playing out with new technology, fear, hope, the desire for meaning, the construction of enemies, the yearning for something eternal in a world that seems increasingly temporary. Climate change begins to dominate the discourse, and Ramses, who remembers when the Sahara was greener, when the Nile's floods were predictable and life-giving, understands the slow violence of environmental transformation. He has watched deserts expand and forests vanish, species disappear and landscapes transform. But the pace of change now is different, accelerated by human activity, by the same ingenuity that built pyramids now applied to extraction and consumption at scales the ancient world could never have imagined. He visits Abu Simbel as a tourist, one among thousands, and sits before the temple as the sun rises, watching the light penetrate the sanctuary just as it was designed to do twice a year, on the anniversaries of his coronation and birth. Except that since the temple was moved, the dates are slightly off, and even this ancient precision, this connection between stone and sky and time, has been disrupted. The other tourists photograph and leave, but Ramses sits for hours, remembering the dedication ceremony, remembering his younger self's pride and certainty, remembering the belief that this monument would ensure his name lived forever. And he thinks, yes, the name has lived, but the man has become something else entirely, something the architect of Abu Simbel could never have conceived. Social media arrives, and with it, a new relationship to time and memory, everyone broadcasting their lives, curating their identities, seeking their own small immortality through likes and shares and digital footprints. Ramses creates profiles under false names, posts occasionally, photographs of Cairo at sunset, thoughts about history, nothing that would draw attention. He has learned, over 4,000 years, that anonymity is the true price of immortality, that to live forever, you must let yourself die over and over, reinventing, relocating, abandoning relationships before questions arise about why you never age. He thinks of his wives, Nefertari, whom he loved, who is buried in the most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Queens, and he remembers her face, her voice, with a clarity that time has not diminished. But he also knows that if she had lived as he has lived, if she had continued beyond death as he has, they would have eventually become strangers to each other. Because immortality does not mean eternal love, it means eternal change. And people who change for 4,000 years become unrecognizable even to themselves. The Arab Spring sweeps through the Middle East. He is in Cairo during the revolution in Tahrir Square, watching young Egyptians demand change, dignity, voice, and he sees in them the same energy that built the pyramids, that fought the Hittites, the same human hunger for agency and meaning, and he feels both connected to them and impossibly distant, because their struggles are immediate, urgent, while his perspective is vast, glacial, worn smooth by the knowledge that revolutions, too, are patterns that repeat. He begins to write, not for publication, but for himself, long meditations on time, on memory, on what it means to accumulate 4 millennia of experience in a single consciousness. He writes about the people he has loved and lost, not just Nefertari, but others across the centuries, friends, lovers, children he allowed himself briefly to father before disappearing, knowing he could not watch them age and die while he remained unchanging. He writes about the nature of knowledge, how his memories of ancient Egypt are perfect, preserved like amber, while his memories of just a few centuries ago are beginning to blur, and he wonders if the human mind, even an immortal one, has limits, if eventually the oldest memories will fade to make room for the new, and if that happens, will he forget being Ramses entirely? Will he wake up one day having lost himself completely to the accumulation of other selves, other centuries? He writes about power, how he once commanded absolute authority, his word equivalent to divine law, and how that power meant nothing, ultimately, how it could not prevent time from flowing, could not protect those he loved, could not even guarantee his own peaceful death. And he writes about beauty, how the sunlight on the Nile looks the same as it did 4,000 years ago, how certain moments of music, art, human connection transcend time, how these small eternities are perhaps more real than his biological immortality, because they can be shared, passed from generation to generation, while his experience remains fundamentally solitary. The COVID-19 pandemic arrives, and for the first time in millennia, Ramses experiences something genuinely new, a global event, unified and immediate, playing out in real time across all nations simultaneously. He has lived through countless plagues, the Black Death, smallpox, cholera, but those moved slowly, across years, hitting different regions at different times. This is different. The whole world locked down at once, connected by digital networks that allow everyone to experience the same fear, the same uncertainty, simultaneously. He is in Cairo during the lockdown, and he finds himself remembering the plagues of Egypt from the biblical story, wondering if he was Pharaoh during the Exodus. The timing is uncertain. Scholars debate it still. But he knows there were disasters during his reign, challenges, crises, and he knows that he met them as all rulers do, with a mixture of pragmatism and propaganda, responding to catastrophe while trying to maintain the image of divine control. He watches on his laptop as cities empty, as the air clears from reduced pollution, as animals reclaim urban spaces, and he sees a truth that immortality has taught him, that human civilization, for all its monuments and noise, is temporary, that nature is patient, that the earth will outlast even him, eventually, that geological time makes even 4,000 years seem brief. As the world reopens, as vaccines roll out and life slowly returns to something like normal, Ramses finds himself in Egypt's western desert, far from cities, alone beneath stars that look the same as they did when he was young, and he allows himself to remember, really remember, not as an exercise in nostalgia, but as an acknowledgement of the weight he carries. He remembers his father, Seti I, a great warrior who prepared him for rule, and he remembers the pressure of expectation, the need to match and exceed his father's achievements. He remembers the Battle of Kadesh, the chaos, the fear beneath the performance of divine confidence, the near disaster that he transformed through propaganda into his greatest triumph. He remembers his children, so many children, and the pain of choosing Merneptah as heir, knowing that others, equally capable, equally beloved, would be passed over. He remembers the building projects, not just as monuments, but as economic programs, employment for thousands, expressions of theological and political vision. And he remembers the small things, the taste of dates and beer, the feel of linen in the desert heat, the sound of singers in the palace, the weight of the double crown on ceremonial occasions, all the sensory details of a life lived 4,000 years ago, details that no history book records, that no archaeology can recover, details that exist now only in his memory, unique and irreplaceable. Artificial intelligence begins to accelerate, and Ramses watches with particular interest as machines learn to think, to create, to simulate consciousness, and he wonders if this, too, is a form of immortality, if humanity is creating digital versions of eternal life, minds that persist beyond biological death, consciousness uploaded and preserved, and he thinks about how different this is from his own immortality, which is stubbornly physical, tied to flesh and blood and the daily experience of breathing, eating, existing in space and time. He experiments with AI programs, feeds them questions about ancient Egypt, and is sometimes impressed by their knowledge, sometimes amused by their confident incorrectness, and he realizes that these systems, for all their power, lack something essential: the lived experience, the sensory memory, the weight of actual presence in history. They know facts, but they do not remember the heat, the smell, the texture of the past. He attends conferences on longevity research, on aging and cellular senescence, on the scientific quest to extend human life, and he listens to researchers describe their goals, their timelines, their hope that humans might live to 150, 200 years, and he says nothing, but he thinks about what they cannot know, that even if they succeed, even if they double or triple the human lifespan, it will not be immortality, it will be extended mortality, a longer story, but still one with an ending, while his story continues, without narrative arc, without climax or resolution, just the endless middle stretch of existence. He returns to Luxor, to the temple complex at Karnak that he expanded, and he walks through the hypostyle hall, among the massive columns, remembering when the roof was intact, when paint brightened every surface, when priests performed rituals that were already ancient in his time. The other visitors see ruins, partial structures, fragments of a vanished world, but he sees both, the past superimposed on the present, the way memory and reality overlap when you have lived long enough to remember what no longer exists. A tour guide explains to a group that Ramses II was one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs, and Ramses, standing nearby, listening, realizes that this judgment, this assessment of his historical importance, means something only because he failed in his actual goal, which was not to be remembered, but to live forever in the field of reeds, to exist in eternal paradise, not to persist in endless mortal wandering. The ancient Egyptians did not seek fame, they sought actual immortality, resurrection in a perfected form, and by that measure, by the measure of his own civilization's values, he has failed catastrophically, alive. Yes, but not in the way that was promised, not in the way that was supposed to matter. He leaves the temple as the sun sets, and he thinks about all the gods he served. Amun-Ra, Ptah, the whole pantheon, and he realizes that he has outlived them. In a sense, they are no longer worshipped, no longer believed in, while he persists, and there is a kind of terrible victory in this, to survive your own gods, but also a loneliness that has no name. There are nights when he dreams, and in these dreams, he is young again, standing in the throne room at Thebes, newly crowned, the double crown heavy on his head, his father's advisors watching him, waiting to see what kind of pharaoh he will be. He wakes in a small apartment in a modern city, the sounds of traffic replacing the sounds of the palace, and for a moment, he cannot remember which century he is in, whether he has lived 1,000 years or 3,000, or whether perhaps the entire immortal journey has been the dream, and the young pharaoh is the reality. But then his eyes focus on the electric lamp, the computer screen, the window showing concrete and glass towers, and he remembers. He remembers everything. The dreams are becoming more frequent, and he wonders if this is his mind's way of trying to integrate the impossible span of his experience, trying to find continuity between the man he was and the man he has become, trying to hold together a self that has been stretched across 4,000 years like fabric worn thin by time. He has lived more than 40 normal human lifespans, has accumulated more memories than any brain should be able to hold. And yet he remembers, not everything, not perfectly, but enough to feel the weight of all those years, all those identities, all those moments of joy and sorrow and mundane existence piled one upon another like sediment forming rock. He has had many names over the centuries, so many he can barely remember them all. Persian names, Greek names, Roman names, Arabic names, European names, each identity carefully constructed, lived in for a few decades, then abandoned when questions begin to arise about his unchanging appearance. He has been a merchant, a scribe, a soldier, a servant, a teacher, a wanderer, always moving, always reinventing, always careful never to become too successful, too visible, too memorable. In the medieval period, he was a Coptic monk for several decades, living in a monastery in Upper Egypt, copying manuscripts, praying the hours, existing in a routine that felt almost like the repetitive rituals of the ancient temples. In the Renaissance, he was a physician in Venice, learning the new anatomy, the new chemistry, watching as the world began to understand the body in mechanical terms rather than mystical ones. In the 19th century, he was a translator in Alexandria, helping European scholars decipher ancient texts, feeding them insights while pretending to discover them through research. And in the 20th century, he has been many things: a taxi driver in Cairo, a janitor in Paris, a night watchman in New York, always choosing occupations that allow him to be invisible, to observe without being observed, to move through the world without leaving too much trace. He thinks often about death, not with fear, but with curiosity, with a kind of longing, even, because death is the one experience he has been denied, the one mystery he cannot solve through lived experience. He has seen countless deaths, from violence, disease, old age, accident. He has held dying friends, has watched strangers expire in streets and hospitals, has witnessed the moment when life becomes absence. But he has never crossed that threshold himself, has never discovered what, if anything, lies on the other side. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with death, with preparing for it, ensuring safe passage, mapping the journey through the underworld. And he remembers believing in all of it: the weighing of the heart, the justified soul, the eternal paradise. But now, after 4,000 years without dying, he wonders if it was all metaphor, if the afterlife exists only in imagination, or if perhaps it exists, but he has been excluded from it by the same anomaly that has kept him alive. He sometimes visits the Valley of the Kings, stands outside the entrance to his tomb, and imagines what it would have been like to follow the path he was supposed to follow, to be mummified, placed in nested coffins, surrounded by grave goods, sent into darkness with spells and prayers. And he feels a strange nostalgia for this death he never experienced, this ending that was supposed to be his beginning. Language has changed, evolved, died and been reborn, more times than he can count. He spoke Middle Egyptian, the language of his youth, of his court, of his prayers, and he watched it transform into Demotic, then Coptic, then fade away entirely as Arabic became the language of Egypt. He learned Greek under the Ptolemies, Latin under the Romans, Arabic during the Islamic period, and then, As the world connected, he learned French, English, Spanish, German, learning and forgetting and relearning, his mind becoming a palimpsest of linguistic systems. There are times when he speaks and a word from ancient Egyptian slips out, a word that has not been spoken in 3,000 years, and if anyone hears, they assume it is a cough, a stutter, a misheard syllable, because the possibility that someone could speak a dead language natively is unthinkable. He reads hieroglyphics on temple walls, and they are not decoded symbols to him, but living language. He can hear the rhythm, the poetry, the puns and wordplay that scholars analyze but cannot truly hear, and this creates a kind of doubled vision, seeing the ancient world both as it was and as it is now imagined, both the lived reality and the reconstructed past. The question that haunts him most is not why has this happened to me, because that question assumes purpose, assumes a reason, a design, and he has long since abandoned the belief that his immortality has meaning or purpose beyond itself. The question that haunts him is when. When will it end? When will he finally be allowed to die? Or is he somehow truly eternal? Will he outlive not just humanity but the earth itself? Will he float in the vacuum of space after the sun expands and consumes the planet, immortal but alone in the cosmic dark? He has researched extreme longevity, has followed the science of aging, of cellular senescence, of telomeres and genetic damage, and as far as he can tell, his body should age, should accumulate damage, should eventually fail. And yet it does not. It maintains itself at approximately the level of a man in his 70s, not young, not vigorous, but stable, unchanging year after year, decade after decade, century after century. He has considered revealing himself to scientists, submitting to study, allowing them to understand whatever mechanism keeps him alive, because perhaps such knowledge could help others, could advance medicine, could alleviate suffering. But he knows what would happen. He would become a specimen, a curiosity, a prisoner of laboratories and governments. He would lose his freedom, his anonymity. And after 4,000 years, freedom is perhaps the only thing he truly values, the ability to move, to choose, to remain unknown. He has loved, many times, across many centuries, though he has learned to love carefully, guardedly, knowing that every love will end in loss. In the 3rd century, he loved a Roman woman in Alexandria, a widow who asked no questions about his past, and he stayed with her for 20 years, watching her age, watching her hair turn grey and her hands grow gnarled, while he remained unchanged. And when she died, he buried her and moved on, carrying her memory like all the other memories. In the 10th century, he loved a scholar in Cordoba, a man of fierce intelligence and gentle humor, and they spent 15 years together, discussing philosophy and astronomy, until questions about Ramses' unchanging appearance became too insistent, too dangerous, and he disappeared one night, leaving only a letter of goodbye. In the 18th century, he loved a bookseller in Paris, a woman who loved stories, who believed in romance and revolution, and he allowed himself to pretend, briefly, that this love could last. But of course it could not, and when she began to notice that he never aged, when suspicion turned to fear, he left again, always leaving, always protecting himself by abandoning what he loves. He has learned not to have children, learned this lesson after several painful experiences, because watching your own children age past you, watching them become elderly while you remain middle-aged, creates confusions and questions that cannot be answered without revealing the impossible truth. There are places he returns to, sacred sites. In a sense, though not in any religious way, places where significant moments of his long life occurred. He visits Abu Simbel, stands before the colossal statues, and remembers their dedication, remembers the faith that built them, the certainty that stone could conquer time. He visits the battlefield of Kadesh, now just fields in Syria, no marker indicating where thousands fought and died, and he remembers the chaos, the fear, the moment when he thought he would die there, surrounded by Hittite chariots, never imagining that 4,000 years later he would return as a tourist, as a ghost of his former self. He visits Alexandria, walks along the harbor where the lighthouse once stood, where the library once held all the knowledge of the ancient world, and he remembers reading there, learning there, watching it burn, watching centuries of accumulated wisdom turn to ash and smoke. And in each of these places, he feels the layering of time, sees the past and present superimposed, exists simultaneously in memory and reality. And this doubled vision is perhaps the strangest aspect of immortality, that you carry the past within you not as history but as lived experience, as sensory memory, as yesterday. Technology fascinates and disturbs him in equal measure. The way it accelerates change, collapses distance, transforms the texture of daily life. He remembers when travel meant walking or riding, when communication meant speaking face to face or sending letters that took months to arrive, when knowledge was scarce, localized, passed from teacher to student in unbroken chains. Now information is instant, global, overwhelming. Anyone with a phone can access more knowledge than the library of Alexandria contained. And yet wisdom seems no more common than it ever was, and people seem no happier, no more certain of meaning or purpose. He uses a smartphone, has learned to navigate social media, search engines, streaming services, and he sees in these technologies both connection and isolation, both the possibility of global understanding and the reality of fractured, partisan, algorithmic bubbles where people increasingly speak only to those who already agree with them. He watches the development of virtual reality, augmented reality, the metaverse, these attempts to create digital worlds, alternative existences, and he wonders if humanity is trying to escape time itself, to create spaces where aging and death do not apply, to build their own version of immortality through technology rather than biology. And he thinks about how his own immortality is different, how it is stubbornly physical, stubbornly temporal. He cannot escape his body, cannot upload his consciousness, cannot exist anywhere but in the continuous flow of lived time. And perhaps this makes his experience more authentic, but also more lonely, because he cannot share it, cannot replicate it, cannot offer it to others. The world is changing faster now than ever before in his long observation, the pace of transformation accelerating exponentially, and he wonders if he is approaching a threshold, a moment when change becomes so rapid that even immortality cannot keep up, when the world transforms so completely that his ancient perspective becomes irrelevant, incomprehensible, unable to parse the new reality. He sees the signs, artificial intelligence advancing towards superintelligence, genetic engineering beginning to rewrite biology, quantum computing promising to solve problems currently inconceivable, climate change reshaping ecosystems, space exploration reaching toward other planets, and he understands that humanity is approaching singularities, points of no return, transformations as significant as the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution, perhaps more so. And he wonders what role, if any, he has in this emerging future, whether his memories of the ancient world have any value in a world that may soon be unrecognizable, whether the perspective of 4,000 years of human history means anything when history itself may be ending, when humanity may be transforming into something post-human, something that makes the distinction between mortal and immortal irrelevant. And yet, despite everything, despite the loneliness and the loss and the weight of endless time, there are moments when he feels something like gratitude. A sunset over the Nile that takes his breath away even after 4,000 years of sunsets, a piece of music that moves him to tears, a stranger's kindness that reminds him that humanity, for all its flaws, remains capable of beauty and compassion. These moments do not justify immortality, do not make the burden light, but they remind him that existence, even endless existence, contains fragments of grace, that wonder is not exhausted by repetition, that the world continues to surprise, to move, to reveal new facets of beauty. He stands in a museum in Cairo, in front of a statue of his younger self, and a child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, stares up at the stone face with wide eyes, and asks her mother, "Was he a good king?" And the mother pauses, then says, "History says he was powerful, he built great things, but good? That is harder to know." And Ramses, listening, realizes that this is perhaps the only honest answer, that 4,000 years of reflection have not given him certainty about his own goodness, that he made choices, some wise and some cruel, some necessary and some merely ambitious, and that the monuments remain while the moral complexity fades. And perhaps this is true for all of us, that we are judged by what we leave behind, not by the fullness of who we were. The child moves on, and Ramses watches her go, this brief life, this spark of consciousness that will burn for perhaps 80 years and then extinguish, and he feels tenderness toward her, toward all of them, toward humanity in its beautiful, terrible brevity. He has no grand plan, no mission or purpose guiding his immortal existence. He is simply continuing, day by day, because continuation is what he does, what he has always done, what he will apparently always do. The night sky has changed, light pollution from cities washing out the stars that were once so vivid, so intimately known, and he remembers when the Milky Way was visible every clear night, when the constellations told stories, when the movement of celestial bodies was magic and science and religion all at once. He travels to the desert sometimes, far from cities, and lies on his back looking up at the stars the way he did as a young pharaoh, when the universe seemed smaller, more comprehensible, more intentional. The same stars, though even they have moved, shifted, changed their positions over millennia, and he knows, in ways that ancient astronomers could not have known, that these stars are temporary too, that they burn and die, that galaxies collide, that the universe itself is expanding, cooling, heading towards some distant heat death when all energy will be evenly distributed and nothing will change anymore, ever. And so the story continues, without climax, without resolution, without the narrative arc that gives human lives their shape and meaning. Ramses II, who once commanded armies and built temples, who once believed he was divine, chosen, special, who once thought immortality would be paradise, continues his quiet existence in the 21st century, one more anonymous face in the crowd, one more witness to the endless human drama of birth and death, creation and destruction, hope and despair. He does not know if his story will ever end, does not know if death will eventually claim him or if he is truly eternal, does not know if there are others like him or if he is alone, does not know why this happened or what it means, and he has learned to live with this not knowing, to accept uncertainty as the permanent condition of his existence. Tomorrow he will wake, and the day after that, and the day after that, the legendary pharaoh who never died, carrying within him the accumulated weight of 4,000 years, watching as the world transforms around him, enduring because endurance is all he knows, continuing because continuation is what immortality means, flowing forward through time like the Nile that sustained his ancient kingdom, constant and changing, eternal and temporary, the same and always, different, forever.